Welcome to part 6 of my 8-part series on science and the Bible. I strongly suggest that you listen to the parts in sequence. Enjoy!
Okay, that's 10 minutes. Let's continue. We need to talk about something called uniformitarianism. Now, this is not Unitarianism. Okay? My father was a Unitarian minister. This is a scientific concept, not a religious concept. Uniformitarianism is vital to evolutionary theory. This is the idea that ever since life appeared on Earth, physical processes have proceeded in the same way and at the same rate, and that slow, steady processes are the explanation for current conditions. Now, this idea is vital to allow the gradual development of new species by tiny steps. Now, let's think about this. Darwin assumed that a steady stream of tiny mutations and environmental stresses resulted in a steady progression of minute changes in life forms. This is because random mutations are not purposeful. They're not designed by anybody. They're just accidental. And accidents are not likely to be helpful. So if they do happen, they have to be small. Large mutant changes would be fatal. Now, this is assumed by all evolutionary theorists. Now, it's very interesting. The Bible actually anticipates uniformitarianism as a strategy to deny the existence of God. Listen to this from 2 Peter chapter 3. Peter says, "Know this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, walking according to their own lusts and saying, 'Where is this promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation.'" That's uniformitarianism. Now, notice what Peter says next. "For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water." So, Peter actually anticipated this concept. Now let's take a look at the classic evolutionary column. If you go to your standard biology textbook today, you will see a picture something like this. Now I know it's hard for you to see the details of this picture, but this picture starts down 650 million years ago, and it brings us up to the present, and it takes us through a number of periods, and in the earliest periods, we've got very simple creatures, and by the time we get up here to around the Devonian period, we start having amphibians and jawed fishes. We move into the time of reptiles. Eventually we get to mammals and dinosaurs. Then we got birds. It's only around this time that flowering plants appear. Then we've got primates. The dinosaurs go extinct. The mammals diversify. And evolution of humans. Humans only appear right here. This is the classic evolutionary column. Right? Now, according to Darwinism, fossils should be found buried in this sequence. Now, I said stratified here. The word strata refers to layers of rock. Now, there are many places in Hong Kong where you can go and you can see layers of rock. And where I grew up in the U.S. in New Jersey, there were streams that I would go to when I was a kid, and we would actually dig around in the streams, and you could pull layers of rock apart, and you'd find fossils in there. Now, if Darwinism is true, and if uniformitarianism is true, we should expect to find layers of strata all over the world in which this sequence of animals appears. Now, it is true that there are some places where you will find chunks of this sequence, but it actually turns out that there are many places where what you see doesn't fit the sequence. And there are also places where you will see creatures from here and from here in the same layer. Now, this is one of the sort of dirty little secrets of evolution that evolutionary scientists don't want anybody to know about. But the fact of the matter is that the fossil record is very complex, and it's not exactly what you expect by looking at this. Now that doesn't disprove Darwinism necessarily, but it does raise questions. All right, well, let's talk about some problems with the theory of Darwinism, and we're going to categorize them first. There are 4 general categories. First, there are basic problems with the theory itself. There are evidences that don't support Darwinism or that fit creationism equally well, or possibly better. There are evidences that are contrary to the theory. There are falsified evidences. Okay. All right, we're going to look at some of these problems. Now, before we do that, I want to do what I like to do every week, which is to spend a little bit of time looking at some amazing creatures. Okay. Tonight, I want to look at the gecko. All right? Now, let me read to you a little bit about the gecko. The gecko lizard can walk across your ceiling upside down without falling off. How does it do this? Until a few years ago, scientists did not know, though they proposed several conflicting theories. Examination of the toe pads of the gecko with optical microscopes at up to 2,000 diameters magnification revealed thousands of little fibers arranged like the tufts of bristles on a toothbrush. Yet the question remained unanswered. An answer was finally provided by the powerful scanning electron microscope in a series of remarkable photographs magnified to 35,000 diameters and more. What was revealed? The gecko has on its toe pads many millions of fine fibers tipped with little suction cups, each about 8 millionths of an inch in diameter. In conjunction with this, the lizard's feet are designed so that the tips of the toes bend or curl upward so that he can peel off the suction cups gradually at each step and not get himself too firmly stuck to the surface. It is estimated that the gecko has at least 500 million suction cups on his toes. The extraordinary microscopic structure of the gecko's lizard's toe pads clearly indicates intelligent, purposeful design. No remotely plausible scheme for the origin of the gecko's suction cups by random mutations and natural selection has yet been proposed by evolutionary theorists. And should some scientists with a clever imagination succeed in devising such a scheme, he would still be without a scrap of fossil evidence to demonstrate that the hypothetical process of evolution actually took place in the past. You can't see with the naked eye the tiny suction cups on a gecko's foot, but each chevron-shaped ridge on the gecko's amazing foot pad is composed of millions of fibers tipped with microscopic suction cups. This enables it to walk upside down across your ceiling or sideways across your wall. Now, there's more. Is it possible that different species of geckos might have different mechanisms on their foot pads? The June 8, 2000 issue of Nature published an article by Keller Autumn, PhD, et al., titled Adhesive Force of a Single Gecko Foot Hair. This team of researchers examined the tiny hairs on the foot of the Tokay gecko and arrived at an astounding conclusion. The Tokay gecko utilizes van der Waals forces to adhere to slick surfaces when scurrying upside down across them. Van der Waals forces are weak, short-range bonds between molecules. Now, let me just show you some pictures. Okay? They have suction cups, at least some of them, and others may have little sticky pads. Okay? By the way, if you had a bank of suction cups and you just stuck it against glass and you tried to pull it off, you can't do it. You've got to peel them up one at a time, and his foot is designed to do that. Okay, now here's a gecko climbing up a glass wall. This is what his feet look like at normal magnification. Now this is what they look like under a scanning electron microscope. Okay? These are the hairy tufts that were being spoken of. And these are the individual fibers with little suction cups on the end of them. Now, do you see this? That's 20 micrometers, or microns. A micron is a millionth of a meter, right? These are very, very tiny things. Okay? And that's what he looks like if you find him. By the way, these things are very vicious. I used to hunt lizards in the Philippines. I would never hurt them. I like to catch things alive. And I caught one once and discovered how vicious they were. Now, I was not bitten, but I have seen people be bitten by these things. And when they clamp on, they don't want to let go. They call them the pit bull of lizards. Very, very interesting and fascinating creature, and a reason to worship as far as I'm concerned. All right. We are going to talk about some problems with Darwin's theory. Okay. Now, one of the first ones has to do with something which you will still see in biology textbooks today, even though it's 130 some years old and has been proven to be a fraud for a long time. This is a drawing by a German evolutionary scientist called Haeckel. Haeckel borrowed a theory from someone else called recapitulation theory. The theory was that if you look at the embryos of simple animals and trace through more complex animals, what you discover is that if you look at a human embryo in the womb developing, it traces this sequence. It first starts looking like a fish, then it starts looking like an amphibian, then it starts looking like, I don't know what this is, a chicken. No, that's a turtle. See the shell? Then it looks like a turtle. And then it looks like a pig, and then it looks like an ape, and then it looks like a human. Now this is still taught in many schools today. It has been proven to be a complete fraud. Haeckel's drawings that supposedly traced the development of the human embryo were made up out of nothing. And by the way, I'm not telling you something that isn't well known. I went on Wikipedia today and I found this. Now in 1868, Haeckel illustrated this theory in a book, and he said that, let's see, this is a dog embryo, this is a chick embryo, and this is a turtle embryo. Now, you notice this is figure 9, figure 10, and figure 11, and if you could see it, the labels are different. He used the same woodcut for each one and just changed the labels, and he presented that as evidence that all of these embryos go through the same sequence. Now you notice down here, he changed this in the next edition. Okay? Now, this is from the same page of Wikipedia. Illustrations of dog and human embryos looking almost identical at 4 weeks and then differing at 6 weeks. Now, these are not photographs. These are drawings by Haeckel. Okay, this is supposed to be a dog and a human, a dog and a human. Now, he said they look the same at 4 weeks and they start to differentiate at 6 weeks. You can see the dog has a long tail and the human only has a short tail. Right? Well, the pictures of the earliest embryonic stages are now considered inaccurate. That's a nice way of saying that he made the whole thing up. Okay? If you ever see this in biology books, don't be fooled by it. By the way, there is no evolutionary advantage to a human embryo going through all the stages of previous creatures in their evolution. There's no reason why that would be carried forward. There's no reason why that would support natural selection. It just was made up out of the blue and presented as evidence of evolution. Even if it were true, it would not support evolution. Okay? Now, stages of gradual change or evidence of a common designer. Look at the skeletons of gibbons, humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans. They're quite similar, aren't they? Now, their similarity could be evidence of an evolutionary sequence, or it could be evidence of a common designer. Now, if you have never seen every Apple computer or every model of Apple computer, you probably still have a general idea of what Apple computers look like. And if you were to see a model that you hadn't seen before, chances are you could probably identify it as an Apple computer, right? I used to ride motorcycles when I was younger, and I knew a lot about motorcycles. And I could look at the engine of a motorcycle and I could tell which company had made it, even though there was no label on it, because there are certain designs, certain methods that they would use, certain ways of solving mechanical problems that were just common to that company. Okay. Similarity of, we can't even find a word for it, right? Similarity of design, once you use the design, right? Similarity of structure does not prove evolution. Similarity of structure does not necessarily prove design either. It can go either way, can't it? Okay. Now, more problems with Darwinism. There are lots of them, folks. Okay, now we've already seen that there are no intermediate forms. The missing links are still missing 160 some years later. Now here's a big one. Beneficial mutations do not occur and they cannot occur. Right, let's talk about this. Genetics is pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? This whole thing about genes and DNA, and I'm not a geneticist, and I don't know if any of you are. Some of you are far more well-versed in this than I am. But the general way that DNA is illustrated these days is we treat it like a computer code. We treat it like a recipe which determines the structure and the function of the creature that has that DNA. Now, let's just follow that analogy. Let's say that DNA is like a computer code. And let's imagine that you've got a factory that's computer controlled that produces black and white televisions. Now, I know that's an old illustration, but I'm an old man, right? Let's just imagine you have a computer controlled factory that produces black and white televisions. Now, you hire computer programmers and engineers and people who know how to run the computer-controlled milling machines and everything that's in that factory to make absolutely sure that that television is built step by step according to the plan. By the way, if you put bad computer code into a computer-controlled milling machine, let's say, a thing that cuts, if you put bad code into it, you can damage the machine. You make the machine cut itself in pieces. I have a cousin who's involved in that, and he says one of the things that's most important is that you be very careful how you program the machine. Now let's suppose your factory is working. The computer code is running through the computer, everything is working, black and white television sets are coming off the line. Everything is great. How many of you think that a tiny bug in your computer program is going to make a better TV come out? How many of you think that a sequence of tiny bugs is going to make a color television come out? No, it's not going to happen. Why does Microsoft hire so many programmers to make such bad software? No. I mean, there's a lot of bad software out there, right? Why do companies hire programmers? Why do companies send out updates to software when they discover bugs? A random error in a computer program is very much like a mutation or a random error in the DNA code. Complex devices, whether they're physical or living, require things to be arranged correctly. And when the genetic code of living things is damaged, typically that particular organism will be sick, it may die, it may not be fully functional. We've all seen birth defects that are caused by genetic damage, and it probably will be sterile. Okay? The idea that random damage to the genetic code of living things is going to produce tiny improvements which will accumulate to major changes, is completely silly. It's completely silly. Now, I've got another book here. This is a really good book. This is called Undeniable. The subtitle is How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. This is written by a professional microbiologist, and he goes through some of the numbers involved in just how unlikely it is that even a single enzyme could be created by accident. And there's nothing in this book you can't understand, by the way. I'm not a microbiologist, and I can understand this book. And he proves that it's absolutely impossible, no matter how old the universe is. It can't happen, right? It simply can't happen. Beneficial mutations do not occur. They have never been observed in nature. There have been efforts to induce them in the laboratory, and they have never occurred. They cannot occur. Okay? Now, secondly, Darwinism is supported by an imagined geological fossil column. Overall fossil evidence does not correlate complexity with recency. In other words, if you look at all of the fossil evidence, you'll find simple animals near the surface, complex animals deep. You will find mixtures. You will find reversed layers. We'll talk about reasons for those later. It just doesn't fit. Excuse me, it just doesn't fit. Now, as I said, the actual fossil column is often shuffled, inverted, and mixed. Now here's a big one. Remember our rabbit who developed a turtle shell? Right? Well, we'll assume that that mutation took place. We'll assume that our rabbit with the turtle shell survived. Now he's got a problem. There's nobody for him to marry. Right? Now, this objection does not apply to the lowest level of creature that may reproduce by fission, right, where they'll just split in half. But once you get to any kind of creature that reproduces sexually, what you have to have is you have to have a random mutation that produces a superior animal that occurs in the same time, in the same place, and the two of them have to find each other, and they have to be fertile, and they have to be of opposite sexes, and you can see that the whole thing is a big joke. The whole thing is a big joke. It cannot happen. It cannot happen. I call this the lonely, hopeful monster. By the way, hopeful monster is a title that evolutionists use. That's a term for the mutant, right? Something that doesn't look like its parents. Now, here's another major problem, which we'll talk about later. Darwinism does not explain the origin of life. Darwinism only explains the development of complex life from simple life, or attempts to do that. Right. Now, genetic studies demonstrate the complexity of DNA, showing that accidental creation of life, which we will see is called chemical evolution, is utterly impossible on any scale. It just can't happen. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. Okay. Now, for these and other reasons, many Darwinists are actually beginning to abandon the theory. But they usually get in trouble if they tell anybody that they're abandoning the theory. Okay. Now, there are lots more problems with Darwin's. Let's talk about the formation of fossils. Remember the uniformitarian scenario? The uniformitarian scenario says that the Earth's environment changes very slowly. Let me blank this out. Okay. Now, this is the way your typical Darwinist will describe the formation of fossils. First of all, they will generally say that life began in the oceans, because the ocean is a nicer environment. By the way, the Bible says just the opposite. Right? But they would say that life begins in the ocean. So you've got, let's say, a fish, and it's swimming around, and it dies. It sinks to the bottom of the ocean, and very slowly sediment comes down and covers it. Now you know that sediment settles on the bottom of the ocean, right? You've all seen what shipwrecks look like. And over time, the sediment piles up until it gets heavy enough and the thing is compressed and it forms a fossil. Okay? Well, that doesn't work. First of all, dead animals typically don't sink. They typically float. Secondly, dead animals don't stay intact. They typically are eaten by larger animals or they rot. Okay? Thirdly, in the bottom of the ocean, there are no fossils being formed today. It isn't happening. The formation of fossils requires a rapid burial of an animal in heavy sediment, so heavy that it produces enough heat that it kills the bacteria. Now, what kind of a situation produces that kind of conditions? The biblical flood, a volcano, right? It's got to be some catastrophic event. Right? The Darwinist who holds to the uniformitarian scenario has no explanation for the existence of fossils. Okay? Now, another problem with the fossil record is something called polystrate fossils. Now, remember, the Darwinist is telling us that we expect to find layers of rock with different kinds of animals, with the simple ones at the bottom and the more complex ones as you go up. Well, there's something very embarrassing that always shows up. You get animals sometimes, or trees, that pierce many layers of sediment. Now, according to the Darwinist, a layer of sediment this thick can represent 100 million years. So why is there a tree that goes from this layer all the way up 4 more layers? How could a tree remain intact for several 100 million years to be in all those layers of sediment? Doesn't make any sense. Okay. Now, many of you have heard of the peppered moth. Have you heard of the peppered moth? The story of the peppered moth, this is the standard illustration of evolution that's given in most biology books. Now here's the story. The peppered moth is a moth that lived in England, and it was basically light-colored with some dark-colored spots. When the Industrial Revolution came to England and they started burning lots of coal to run steam engines, England became covered with soot. You know, you've all heard of the famous London fog that they used to have. That was basically smog. It was soot and sulfur from burning dirty coal that was mixing with the fog. And London was a very dirty, black place in the 1800s. Now, people observed that those moths, which had typically been light-colored with dark-colored spots, eventually ended up being mostly dark-colored with a few light-colored spots. And their explanation was that the light-colored ones, when they would land on trees or surfaces, would be very easy to see and the birds would come down and eat them. Now, that may or may not be true. It is possible that what was going on there was natural selection. Right? Now, natural selection is real. The survival of the fittest is real. Right? You've all seen these African safari movies where the leopard goes after the herd of antelope, and it always goes after the slow one. It always goes after the sick one, right? And the narrator will say, see how nature culls out the bad genes. Well, maybe that's what's happening. But culling out bad genes is not the same as creating new, better genes. Right? Now, in a case where natural selection does remove the unfit members of a species, that is what we would call microevolution. Microevolution is real, but microevolution does not produce new species. Microevolution can, however, favor varieties within a species. Now, what was happening with the peppered moth was what we would call variegation. there were varieties of peppered moths. Some favored the light color with dark spots, others favored the dark color with light spots. The ones that could survive may well have been selected, although there's actually much doubt today whether this thing really happened. There seems to be some evidence that the whole thing was made up. But if you look at those moths today, they're all back to the light color with the dark spots. Okay. That's not macroevolution. Now, in Darwinian terminology, Darwinism is macroevolution. It's the creation of new species through mutation and natural selection. Microevolution is simply the elimination of unfit individuals within a species without the creation of any new species. Okay. Now, something to think about, by the way, is that there can be enormous variation within a species. Now, think about the common dog, right? In Hong Kong, you got dogs this big that people carry around in their purses, right? And you got dogs like our next door neighbor. Our next door neighbor has a big golden retriever. Now, why he has a dog like that living in a tiny flat, I don't know. But, I mean, think of all the different kinds of dogs there are, right? All of those dogs are one species. They're all genetically compatible. They're all able to reproduce with each other. All of that genetic richness was placed in dogs by God when He created dogs originally. And what humans have done is they have selectively bred to pull out particular genetic traits in particular breeds of dogs, but they're all dogs. Now you can imagine a situation where you got 20 dogs of many different species, and let's say you set them loose on Taimo Shan and wait and see which ones live. And most likely, the big strong ones will live and the little tiny ones will get eaten by the monkeys, right? Right. Now when that happens, that's going to be microevolution. That is natural selection. But there's no creation of a new species. Okay? Now, here's an interesting question. If newer species survive preferentially over older, less adaptable species, why do the older ones continue to exist? Darwinism doesn't really have any answer for this. You know, they like to talk about living fossils. They like to say that sharks are living fossils. You know, they've been around for 400 million years, but they still survive. Well, then why did anything develop from them if they were so successful? Doesn't make sense. Okay? As we said earlier, the actual fossil record often shows simple and complex organisms living together. And here's one that may shock you. There is evidence that man and dinosaurs existed together. Okay? There's a place in Texas that my wife and I and our children have been to where you can walk on sedimentary rock where there are dinosaur and human footprints in the same layer of rock. There are even a few places where there are human footprints in the dinosaur footprints. I have touched those things. I have seen them. What's beeping? It's quite impressive. The Bible also talks about that, by the way, in the book of Job, Leviathan and Behemoth. If you read the descriptions of those, they do not sound like elephants or crocodiles, although some people try to claim that. They sound like dinosaurs. One sounds like a land dinosaur, one sounds like an ocean dinosaur. Okay? Now, Darwinism contradicts the second law of thermodynamics. Without intelligence, accidents can't produce order. Now let's think about the most simple example of order that we could come up with. Let's suppose that I were to stack up 20 dominoes. Okay? Just sitting flat on top of each other on this table. And then I kick the table. What's going to happen? They'll fall over. Okay? Now, how many of you think that if I shake the table long enough, we're going to get a stack of 20 dominoes again. It's never going to happen. Now, if I shake it for a while, we might get one domino on top of another. We might get lucky and we might get 3 dominoes stacked. But random effects always destroy faster than they create. So if we get 3, they're going to fall over again. We're never going to get 20. By the way, stacking 20 dominoes is an utter joke compared to the simplest living thing that exists. See, the second law of thermodynamics says that there will never be a progressively increasing, how should I describe it? There'll never be a sequence of random events that produces increasing order. It isn't going to happen, right? Random effects destroy faster than they create. Even the people who claim that they believe in Darwinism don't believe it. You'll see why. We'll talk about that later. Okay, more problems. Where are all the fossils of our humanoid ancestors? If man has been developing for millions of years, humanoid fossils should be plentiful. If, on the other hand, the Earth is young, the lack of fossils is easily explained. By the way, some people just working on the evidence that we actually have rather than using evolution have argued that there may possibly be more people alive on the Earth today than in all of previous history combined. Right? Interesting thing to think about. Right? Now here's a big one. If you look at fossils, they invariably show animals in good health and in the prime of life dying suddenly. And if you've seen fossils of higher animals, you often see them in agony. Now, according to Darwinism, fossils should be old, sick animals, because they say that fossils are formed when animals die and fall and are buried. And typically speaking, most animals live to maturity. But we don't see that. You find healthy, fully developed animals often dying in states of agony. There are fossils of a fish swallowing a fish. Right? There are all kinds of things like this. It doesn't fit what evolution suggests, but it fits the flood perfectly. Okay. Now, if we're going to allow the Bible to inform our thinking, and I think we should, if we are Bible-believing Christians, Jesus believed in the literal truth of Genesis. He repeatedly confirmed God's word. He said all of it is true. Paul confirmed the reality of Adam as the head of the race and the historicity of the fall. Right? And any denial of the historicity of Adam as the head of the human race undermines the truth of Christ's saving work. 1 Corinthians 15:21-22 says, "For as in Adam all die, so in Christ shall all be made alive." Now, I won't take you through it now, but the basic argument of Romans chapter 5, verses 12-21, is that the reason we are all sinners is that we are all descendants of Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve sinned, their nature was changed, and they transmitted to us their sinful nature. Now, if there was no Adam and Eve, there's no way to explain the fall. Right? Or if Adam and Eve were just one couple among thousands of other human beings or subhuman beings or whatever, what they did would not affect us. Okay? Now, if you want to get really theological, I'll just give you this to you very, very quickly. Romans chapter 5 says this. It says that we were in Adam when he sinned. Genetically, we were in him. And Paul goes further. He says, because we were in Adam, we are guilty of his sin. Now, I hope that makes all of you upset. It makes me upset. Why should I be responsible for the sin of my ancestor? But in reality, that's the best thing that could happen, and here's why. If there were not a legal precedent that the sin of one person could make many people guilty, it would not be possible for the righteous act of one person to make many people righteous. You see that? That's God's logic. Okay? If we didn't fall in Adam, we couldn't all be saved in Christ. Right? If we didn't fall in Adam, Jesus could die for just one person. But the legal precedent that we fell in Adam provides the foundation for Christ's one sacrifice on the cross to pay for all of us. That is the whole theological foundation of God's plan of redemption. And evolution is a direct attack on it. It's a direct attack on it. Okay, so this is a very strong theological reason for holding to biblical creation. Now we've got about 7 minutes left. I'll show you one more slide, and then I want to show you some interesting things. Just some beautiful things. Okay? Let's talk about fossil frauds and fiascos. Right? If Darwinism is true, the biblical account of Adam and Eve is false. And Darwinists have been eagerly searching for mankind's evolutionary ancestors pretty much ever since the theory came out and people latched onto it. Now let's look at the record of this. Piltdown Man was discovered in England in 1912. Now all this was a skull. Right? People were very excited about Piltdown Man. They said, this is mankind's ancestor. It's not Homo sapiens, it's something else that came before man. Well, it was later exposed as an intentional forgery made from a skull which was stained to make it look old, and teeth that were filed intentionally to hide the fact that they came from a normal human being. Then we come to Nebraska Man. This one is actually my favorite. Nebraska Man was believed to be a human ancestor. At the time when he was discovered, people made elaborate drawings showing exactly what he looked like, how tall he was, how the male looked, how the female looked, what their lifestyle was. There are even museums that built, these little tableaus with the statues in them, to look like Nebraska Man. Well, Nebraska Man was created from a single tooth found in a farmer's field in Nebraska. That's all they had. One tooth. Later the tooth was proved to be from a pig. Okay. Java Man. Okay. Java Man was found in Indonesia. He was considered to be a great find. They had a skull cap, a few teeth, and a femur. That's all. Not a full skeleton. Now the finder, a man named Dubois, later admitted that the bones were found over a span of several years, not all in the same place, with no proof that they came from one creature, and he finally admitted that they probably came from a gibbon. Neanderthal Man. You've all heard of Neanderthal Man, right? Neanderthal Man is the typical caveman who drags his wife around by her hair, and says ugh, and all those things. Right? Now there have been many specimens of Neanderthal Man found. Right? These are typically found in Europe. This was thought to be a human ancestor because of his stooped gait. If you look at his skeleton, he's kind of bent over. But now evidence suggests that he was an ordinary human being with a vitamin D deficiency. He had rickets. Okay? By the way, if you look up Neanderthal Man, you will see all kinds of interesting explanations of how he could be our ancestor, because the weird thing is, most of these Neanderthals had very large brain capacities. Right? Rather strange. Now, they did artwork in caves that shows that they were skilled hunters. There's evidence that they did brain surgery. and there's evidence that they believed in the afterlife. Does that sound like an ancestor? No. Even many evolutionary scientists are coming to the conclusion that Neanderthal is just an ordinary human being. All right, and then there's Peking man. All right? 10 skeletons that were allegedly found in a cave near Peking between 1927 and 1937. They all mysteriously disappeared in 1941. Nobody's ever seen them since, and there's some doubt that they ever existed. The record is not very good. Okay? The record is not very good. Okay, now it's good that these things have been exposed, but it's sad that this one up here was an intentional fraud. Okay? This one was just foolish. This one may have been an intentional fraud. There's ongoing investigation into this that is suggesting that it may well have been an intentional fraud. Okay. Now we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to show you some fun things. Okay. I want to show you something called diatomaceous earth. Okay. And you may have heard of diatoms. Diatoms are algae that have a very interesting kind of cell wall made out of silicon dioxide hydrated with a small amount of water. Now, silicon dioxide is basically glass, and opals are made out of silicon dioxide with water. Some people call these algae in glass houses. Now, you can buy diatomaceous earth in the store. When I was a kid, my father had a swimming pool, and in the filter we would put diatomaceous earth. It's very fine, and it's used in filtration. It's also used as an insecticide. It's very interesting. It's not poisonous, but if you put it on an insect, it works its way into the insect and it dehydrates the insect and kills it. It's a kind of insecticide that is safe for plants and is safe around children. Some people even eat this for medicine. Right? There's some doubt about that. Okay? This is what it looks like. It's just a white powder. Okay? Now, it comes from a kind of sedimentary rock. It's formed from the skeletons of diatoms. Here's a picture of a man in a diatomaceous earth layer. You can see the way it's laid up in sedimentary layers. See the lines? Now, if you look at diatomaceous earth under an electron microscope, look what you see. Okay, here's another picture. Now this is just from that cup, right? Now take a look at the scale. This is 10 microns, right? 10 micrometers, 10 millionths of a meter. See the structures here? Now these are not carefully selected specimens. You can see they're broken. But take a look at the next one. That's a living thing. Now, I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I've been doing some reading, and there is currently evidence suggesting that the amount of information necessary to create living things is more information than DNA can carry. Now here's a really interesting thing. We like to talk about DNA as being like a computer code, right? But in order for a computer code to work, you've got to have a computer. Where's the computer for DNA? By the way, nobody knows why a certain sequence of amino acids in DNA causes certain characteristics in the animal. Nobody knows that. All we know is that it does. See, there's something going on here that's very special. Now take a look at this one. This one is awesome. That's an algae. Look at that. Is that not gorgeous? Look at this one. It's just beautiful. Here's another. Look at that. Now, the next one reminds me of Shrek. Beautiful stuff. Look at this one. It's like a tiny sand dollar. And then look at the fine structure in this picture. Now, I think this is God's handiwork. This is God hiding things for us to discover that should lead us to worship. It's just gorgeous. Look at these. These are living diatoms. These aren't just skeletons. These are pictures from an optical microscope. We're at a much higher scale here. Okay. Beautiful things. Look at the next one. This is the last one I've got. Look at that. Those are just algae. Look at the level of complexity. It's just amazing, right? Now, we've got a lot more to talk about. There's lots more to talk about with regard to the problems of Darwinism. Next week, we will continue our discussion of Darwinism. We'll get as far as we can with Darwinism. We're going to move into a discussion of the age of the Earth, the age of the universe. And I hope we'll have some time to talk about the fallout of Darwinism in society. Okay? We're out of time, so let's pray and let's go. All right. Father, it is wonderful to just finish by looking at some of the tiny things that you made, things that for thousands of years people have been unable to see, and yet they were there all along. Things that testify to your infinite genius and to your ability to create beauty. Father, we thank you that, as your word says, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Thank you for these bodies that move us around, that give us enjoyment, that heal themselves. Thank you for giving us minds so that we can think about you, that we can ponder the realities of this amazing universe. Father, we pray that you would strengthen our confidence in you as our Creator, that you would lead us into deeper worship, that you would enable us to be careful as we hear the results of modern science, and to accept what is good and to reject what cannot be true. This we ask through Christ. Amen. Okay, Steve.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed or benefited from this study of science in the Bible, I hope you'll recommend it to others. Please also like, subscribe, and share. See you in the next part of the series.